As a child growing up in Texas and Mexico, my heroes were Indians and cowboys. So several years ago, when I was enjoying a fellowship on a remote ranch west of Austin, Texas, I intended to write a novel set in the 19th century in the American West, a Western. The cowboys and Indians that I had imagined all my life had come mostly from family stories, or worse, from Hollywood. So before I wrote a page, I did a good deal of research into the day-to-day lives of the Comanche Indians and cowboys, and the facts were so seductive they challenged my imagination. 19th century Texas was necessarily diverse because there were so many people from different cultures struggling and fighting one another, trying to inhabit the same space. I never intended to take over a decade to write this novel, but as I stared at daguerreotypes and read diaries and journals and blood-stained Civil War documents and handwritten letters, my cast of characters kept growing. I ended up with 17 major characters. I don't know how many minor ones there are. I've never counted them. There are Indians and cowboys, but there are also a wagon train of settlers. There are rebel and Union soldiers. There's a German immigrant outlaw, an Indiana farmer's daughter, a ruthless Comanchero, some runaway slaves, a New York City suffragette, Mexican peasant farmers, and a goodly number of gamblers, drummers, trappers, painted ladies, and preachers. The book's title, Tejano, comes from the Spanish Tejano, which means a Texan of Mexican descent. The Comanches had no written language at that time, and they adopted that word to be their term for Texan, whom they saw as a different tribe from the white people who were Taivo. They hated the Texans much more than the Taivo because the Texans were simply the white people who were trying to take their place, settle in their land, and the other white settlers were just passing through. I want to read two scenes from the novel. The first takes place about 18 years before the second one, but there's a drover named Portus Gore, and his nickname is Eye, E-Y-E, because he has a jumpy eye, and he has a role in each of these scenes. This first scene, I have to thank the late, great George Garrett, the maestro, for triggering this. While I was living on that ranch, I drove one day the 20 minutes down to the paved road in the mailbox, and George had sent a cassette of a National Public Radio show that he was on with 5 other writers, in which each writer wrote a short story using an image that George had come up with. He had done something similar to this years earlier with an assignment that turned into a book, an anthology of poems and stories called The Girl in the Black Raincoat, and every poem or story in it had to have a girl in a black raincoat. And I always lamented the fact that, I had missed out on the opportunity to be part of that. So when I got that tape, the new image was the wedding cake in the middle of the road. I hurried back to the ranch and ran into the writing shed and sat down and wrote a piece with a wedding cake in the middle of the road just in case, something came of it. And because I was in New Orleans in 1844 at the time in the novel, that's where I set the wedding cake piece. And then much later, when I was working on the novel, I realized that that exercise might be something useful. So I thought it might be fun to read at a writer's conference where perhaps you're doing exercises every now and then, to see that they can sometimes turn into something useful. In this scene, there's a young, poor German immigrant. He's just arrived in New Orleans. He's in a bar, and he encounters this ne'er-do-well, jack-of-all-trades, Portus Gore, that I mentioned earlier. In a windowless saloon close by the wharf, a room long and narrow, dimly lighted by oil lamps on the wall behind a plank bar, Rudolph spent a piastre on a cocktail and got several Prussian silver groschen in change. The barkeep poured brandy in a glass, added a drop of water, stirred in sugar. The first sip coated Rudolph's tongue with an itchy sweater of sweetness. At a table by the door, a whore sat between two boatmen, both her hands busy, one in each man's lap. Light slanted across bottles and glasses, the door opening. Rudolph was surprised to hear rain pelting the street. A man came in, an oilcloth slicker slapping against his legs. Rudolph recalled storms at sea. "God damn this New Orleans weather," the man said, "pouring down and the sun still shining." "Devil's beaten his wife," the barkeep said. The man smelled like a wet dog. Rainwater off his slicker pooled on the packed earth floor. A brass spittoon with no shine left sat beside the man's boots, which were huge with mud. His left hand was brown as the plank it rested upon and bore the dark whorl of a scar, round as a knothole. The first finger ended in a brown stub at the first knuckle. The others ended with splayed, horn-thick nails. Under the wide end of each nail was a curve of pitch black. The long barrel of a military pistol poked out from beneath the slicker. The heavy gun clattered down upon the bar, and the man rested his right hand on the butt. With a motion as natural as scratching an itch, the man reached behind the bar and came up with a full bottle of rum. One eye fixed and unmoving, the other jumpy as a flea, the man held the cork in his teeth and drew off the bottle. He spat the cork into the spittoon and put the moving eye on Rudolph. The man tilted the bottle and splattered the plank bar for the seconds it took for the barkeep to position an empty glass under the fall of rum. Rudolph placed the last of his piasters alongside the foot-long pistol barrel and, trying to hide any trace of an accent, offered to buy the man a drink. "If you ain't the tallest Dutchman I ever saw." The man lifted his hand from the pistol long enough to give Rudolph's a rough shake. "Portus Gore from Texas. I answer to I, or just Gore." The man's jumpy eye and his several scars made him appear older than Rudolph judged he was. I told anyone who cared to listen that he had been working a wrecker's boat scavenging the Texas coast from Galveston Inlet to Aransas Inlet. Threat of war with Mexico cut down on shipping. Then a spell of calm weather cut down on storms. So he took a job as an enforcer for a broker in land grants, but that got near about unpleasant. A dispute over property rights nearly cost him his life, but he only paid half a finger. His upper lip surprised him and grew back. All he figured he had left was to become a drover. Texas beeves drove to New Orleans ain't worth but $1 or $2 a head. "It's a fact, money's a problem," the whore said. "Not having any makes me feel downright mean," I said. "How mean?" the whore said. "Mean enough to do what I do." I looked at Rudolph and shook his head. Damn fool immigrants. He held out his glass and the barkeep filled it again. "How bad can it be over there for you folks to keep coming, full of questions as children?" he asked Rudolph, who only shrugged. "Load after load, I meet them at the Galveston dock with Mexican handcarts. They pile the carts high with trunks of Sunday clothes, as if there'll be any place fit to wear them, and farm tools, as if anything'll grow in the wild horse desert I'm leading them to. They get a labor of land and a 60 by 90 foot town lot, a red square of dirt. Other colonies, Austins, DeWitts, Burnett's, give a league of land and a 2-acre town lot. I get my pay all the same." I turned and faced the whore. The shadow of his hat brim hid his expression, but she felt his jumpy eye moving all over her. "I'm not so mean I don't hate my part. What's the expression in books? An exercise in futility? Sure, I tell them about the country. Land on fire, it burns. Wind rises with the sun and blows hot all day. Locusts buzz the noise of blood rushing in your ear. Land as far as you can see, red and crusty as a scab. Everything that grows has thorns. Mesquite, prickly pear, Spanish dagger. Everything that breathes stings. Ants, tarantulas, centipedes, scorpions, and snakes. Every kind of snake from every kind of nightmare. Except there won't be no water moccasins like near the Gulf. No more mosquitoes neither, not enough water. Prairie snakes, fast as a horse at trot, rattlers, slower, more deadly. I tell them about it. It's a country of parasites you're walking a month to. Bot flies lay eggs on horses, bore into stomachs, turn into worms. Gadflies lay eggs in old tick wounds. Day and a half hatch maggots. What grows besides hardship and misery? Well, there's corn, I tell them. You'll have cornbread for breakfast and coffee made from roasted corn. For lunch, corn mush with your cornbread, and supper's the same, another cup of corn coffee. Sometimes a jackrabbit, all bone and muscle. Sometimes prairie dog. When you're hungry enough, prickly pear. I tell them, you'll scatter them seeds. You'll plant corn, melons, beans, peas, and everything but some of the corn will burn up. And you'll wish it would too. Set out orange and apple trees, they wither and die. I took a pull on his rum, and Rudolph filled his mouth with a sweet brandy cocktail. I tell them, but you think it does any good? Listen, I tell them, cattle die of thirst. You'll share alkali water with your plow horse or mule till everything burns up in the fields, and you start thinking about horse meat, mule steak. The bartender topped off I's drink. The man nodded and went on. Widow Kruger, Indians killed her man, rode off with her daughter, left her one son. Son went off his head in the heat, wandered around, fell into a den of rattlers. That coily nightmare. I was at the burying. Hot gust of wind come up and blew Widow Kruger's hat down in the boy's grave. It plopped down on his blanket. No trees, no wood for a box. Then she went hatless in the sun, hoping for her brains to fry. Think on it. I looked around the barroom as if to gauge the effect of his tale on his listeners. But these people persist in their foolishness. The Lord's supposed to watch over idiots and children, add immigrants. They cut loose the only slaves in the colony. They made up to the Mexicans and talked about irrigation. Herr Lindheimer shot a tough old deer, and they invited the freed slaves and the Mexicans and a couple of starving old Indians. Thanksgiving, like them other pilgrims. For the first time all afternoon, the whore smiled, and her hands lay still in the laps of the men she sat between. Crazy idea, could have been anybody's. They'd all been too long in the sun. To have a wedding party, marry everyone to this new life. I smiled. I reminded them married life's hell. He winked at the whore. No flour or sugar for a wedding cake. The women got 3 of their round hat boxes, biggest box on bottom, middle-sized box next, then that there little one atop. For icing, they spread cornmeal mush all over and set him out in the sun to bake hard as adobe. Old man Waldeck produced a jar of powdered arsenic, carried all the way from Germany to kill weeds and rats. Ain't no weeds and rats surviving here in the New World, so they put the poison to a different use, mixing a spit paste to whiten up the icing. Better not lick the bowl nor stick a finger in for a taste. The way they all wasted most of the day making that cake put me in mind of them people in the Bible melting down all they gold to make that cow idol. Rudolph wanted another brandy, but he hated to interrupt, and he wasn't sure he had enough money. Finally, a reason to open them trunks for fancy duds and keepsakes they'd toted across the ocean. Late afternoon and hot as the hinges of hell, they set the wedding cake out in the dusty street and promenaded in embroidered shirts with stand-up collars, wool frock coats, round felt hats from out of them cake-shaped boxes. Their faces, red as the desert, stuck out of white collars above black coats. They looked like buzzards circling. Indians saw the cake sitting out in the road, war danced all around it. Freed slaves laughed, Mexicans called it a fandango. Old sun went down sudden into the barren land. Heat underfoot all night. Hot winds died down like a burned-out fire. Mexican guitars and Indian drums stirred the still night air, and it throbbed with the heat like coals. All night, they grinning to beat the band. Mexicans strummed songs about love. Yesterday's slaves crazy danced. Indians did story pantomimes, and every Dutchman sang German beer hall songs to the fiery taste of mezcal. I stared at the swallow left in the bottom of his glass, as if he wondered where all his drink had gone. Them people, they hang on to their foolishness like a comet to its tail. I shook his head and polished off the dregs in his glass. And what for? Next day, the wedding party's over, the sun hot as ever. No honeymoon out there. Next day, wool coats and felt hats packed back in trunks, put away with all their chivalry. Next day, the hollow wedding cake was still baking in the sun. So many layers of hot air, a graven image of sweetness, poison to eat. Now, this second scene, which is set 18 years later in 1862, is from the point of view of Nobby Cotton, who's a runaway slave. Nobby is a first-rate horseman, and some years earlier, he encountered this same storyteller, Portus Gore, and he actually saved Gore's life, saved him from being trampled in a cow chute by the New Orleans docks. And Portus told him that regardless of the color of his skin, any man who could sit a horse as well as Nobby could get a job in Texas, no questions asked, because so many of the cow handlers had gone east to fight in the war. In this chapter, Nobby has rescued his intended, Elizabeth, from a slaver in New Orleans. And as an added deterrent to their escape, the slaver had stripped them of all their clothes earlier. So the two runaways slip into the swamp. They smeared their naked skin with mud to protect them against insects and brush and thorns and so forth. They're following a hand-drawn map that was given to them by another slave named Joseph. The map is supposed to help them get all the way across South Louisiana to Texas, where Nobby hopes to confirm what Gore told him about the need for horsemen. 2 days into the swamp, they're both exhausted, and they're both starving, and Elizabeth is getting pretty depressed. Nobby and Elizabeth followed Joseph's map, walking at night south and west, except 2 times when they saw armed men on horses encircled wide around. Joseph's bag of yams and hoe cakes lasted 1 day. The second morning, they were hungry, and Elizabeth was despondent. Nobby saw in the tops of distant trees a blue different from the sky, and knew that blue as rising wood smoke. Wood smoke meant cooked food. Nobby zigzagged them closer to the smoke. At a narrow bayou, they tried to quiet their stomachs by filling them with water. Mid-afternoon, they hid in a thicket, out of sight of a batson board shack, its brick chimney sending up the smoke Nobby had spotted. So close were they to the shack, night breezes brought the smell of bacon and the slap of a slammed door, followed by the yawp of a hound off after some scent. When the hound bayed again, Nobby let out his breath because the howls were growing distant. Nobby, we got to acknowledge the corn. We're in a fix. I'm so almighty hungry, I'll soon give out. It was the first time Elizabeth had spoken all day. I know. I have to reason this out. Lord, help me provide. Show me what to do. You reason like all creation. She slipped off, but soon came back with her arms full of brown pine needles she spread on the ground, thick and soft, where she lay down. You reason, Nobby. She put her head down and soon was asleep. Nobby lay beside Elizabeth. He had to close his eyes. Soldiers, a farmer, anyone might come along, might kill them while they slept. But even if someone killed them, he had to sleep. Dear Lord, he thought, watch over. And it was that quick dawn, and he was back awake, unkilled all night, still alive in a world of danger. In her sleep, Elizabeth resisted him less, her cheek nestling inside his arm. Mosquito bites covered her forehead, and mud streaked her nose and cheeks. Her arms were laced with tiny cuts from twigs and thorns. Damn everything to hell, Nobby thought. I will get her to Texas, or farther to Mexico, or all the way to California. Nobby left Elizabeth sleeping and crept close enough to the farm shack to see a gray-haired, bony man hitch an even bonier mule to a harness. The legs of the man's overalls were rusty with clay. The man shouldered shovel and axe, put on a straw hat with a brim so frayed it looked fringed, then plodded in heavy-looking brogans after the mule he was driving toward a field of parched-looking corn. The baying hound of the night just past lay in the dirt before the house, a brown lump so motionless Nobby would have taken it for a rock had he not seen the animal walk 3 circles before dropping to the earth. From inside the house came singing, a woman's voice, so pure and strong, it was all Nobby could do not to join in when she sang, all my trust on thee is stayed, all my help from thee I bring, cover my defenseless head with the shadow of thy wing. All morning, Nobby waited from his spying place, and all morning the voice from inside the house serenaded him. His stomach growled so he feared the woman would hear it over her own singing. He should have waked Elizabeth to tell her where he was going, but she had looked like a sleeping child, and he couldn't bring himself to disturb her rest. He hoped if she waked to find him gone, she would know he was coming back for her soon, and she'd keep herself hidden inside the thicket. The sun was almost overhead when the singer finally came outside, a woman too young-looking to be the wife of the skinny old man who had traipsed off behind the mule. The woman wore a bonnet and carried a basket and a bucket. She hummed as she walked toward the field, where the man and his mule had become 2 small dark shapes that leaned forward as if into a strong wind, inched forward from right to left. The woman stopped humming, cocked her head, turned back and said, Grover, you worthless hound, come on with me. There was a long moment in which absolutely nothing happened. Then the dog slowly pushed himself up, his front legs pushing up step by step, while his behind didn't budge. Then he pulled himself forward, and the stiff hind legs came along. Once he was up on all 4s, the dog stretched, his back dipping down until his belly disappeared in the grass. Then he was off behind the woman, the tip of his up-curled tail dancing merrily above the tall grass beyond the dirt yard. Good dog, Nobby thought. almost out loud. "Get on out of here with your nose and your growl and bark, and most especially with your bite." Keeping the board house between himself and the woman, Nobby walked slowly in a half crouch toward the door. When the woman stopped and switched her basket and bucket from one hand to the other, Nobby stopped too. His heart beat so his chest ached, and he was dizzy enough he thought he might fall down. The woman went on without looking back, and he ran the rest of the way to her house. His hand on the wood latch, he held his breath. He had to force the door to move on its leather hinges. The board scraped loudly against the dirt floor. From the doorway, he could not see the woman now behind the house. He bent under the low door frame and stepped in. Heat rose up his naked body so sudden, he took it first for fear. Then he joined the heat to the woman's cook stove. The room was dark and smoky, the ceiling not much above his head. A lingering smell of bacon made his stomach buckle. His bare feet, so quick and light they barely touched the ground. He ran to a crude pine cabinet and opened it. "Forgive me, Lord, now I'm a thief. Lord, help me not get caught." He grabbed a feed sack dress and a worn pair of overalls. On the warm stovetop, he found a stack of corn dodgers and one sweet potato. He had a moment's guilt. This potato was the woman's lunch. Then he dropped it and the bread onto the folded square of the dress he carried on top of the overalls. 3 eggs sat in a basket on a rough-hewn table, and he dropped them onto the dress and folded it over the food. One small window in the room. It had no glass, but a leather-hinged, solid pine shutter someone had swung open. Looked out on the field where the man and the mule still leaned into the space before them. The hound sat beside the woman's basket. Where was she? Nobby whirled, ran through the door, and almost collided with the woman who was coming back in. A foot apart, they stood and stared at one another. This close, she didn't look so young. Her face, in spite of the bonnet, was sun-browned and wrinkled, her lips scabbed and cracked. In her dark hair, threads of silver shone in the sun, bright as a knife's freshly honed edge. She wore a feed sack dress like the one Nobby had just stolen. Her mud-stained feet were bare. She did not move a muscle, but her eyes got bigger. From the inside out, the dark pupils opening up like a flower bud in the sun. Her head was tipped back so her eyes looked up at Nobby's. What a sight I must be, he thought. He held the bundle of stolen clothes and food down below his waist, covering his nakedness as well as possible. Patches of mud and an occasional leaf still stuck to his skin and hair, and he felt dried streaks of mud around his eyes and mouth. Were there still wild Indians around here, he thought, she'd like as not take me for a heathen savage in war paint. If she screams, oh, if she screams. Mistress, he held his finger to his lips. Mistress, please. Oh, please, Lord Jesus. Her eyes pulsed and her lips twitched, but still she did not scream. Mistress, I'll not tell you a lie. I've had a difficult time of late. My woman and I haven't eaten since day before yesterday. We are freed slaves, but highwaymen stole all our clothes. They took our freedom papers. They whipped my woman and were going to sell us back to being slaves. We slipped away in the dark and have been running and hiding since. The woman looked around as if she was trying to figure where she was. She made a croaking in her throat. Mistress, My nakedness shames me, and it shames my woman as well. Nabi let the overalls unfold from his hand, and he held them against his stomach. He tried to stand with his naked legs behind the unfolded legs of the overalls. I heard your pretty song this morning, your song, Jesus, lover of my soul. Mistress, you and I sing to the same Lord. He's master of us all. He gave you a voice pretty as a bird, pretty as any one of his singing birds. We got no money for slaves to do our chores. The woman's voice went husky. I know you all to pieces for a runaway. My man wouldn't hold with helping no runaways. She looked over her shoulder as if her husband might be coming up behind her. He wouldn't hold with nothing might bring down militia patrols on us. They call themselves Prairie Rangers, but they're just prairie bandits. They come checking right regular, hunting Cajuns and niggers alike, scooting all around after trouble. Nabi looked over his shoulder, too, stared back through the dim room and out the bright square of the window that framed the small, dark shapes of the man and the mule. They still moved from right to left, their give and take as unchanging as some ocean wave God might have misplaced when he made the world. One perpetual tide God had breathed in motion in a small field of dying corn far from any sea. Nabi wasn't sure how long he and the woman stared at one another. It could not have been as long as it seemed. Her lips trembled as if she were about to cry out, and before she could utter a sound, with no idea why he was doing it, softly, Nabi began to sing. Jesus, lover of my soul, let me to thy bosom fly, while the nearer waters roll, while the tempest still is high. The woman tilted her head sideways, the way a bird on a limb will tilt its head. And as if she had no control over her lips and tongue and throat and lungs, she joined Nabi in singing, hide me, O my Savior, hide till the storm of life is past. Safe into the haven guide, oh, receive my soul at last. They both stopped, chests heaving. The woman pulled her bonnet off her head, bunched it up in her fist. You get off this place, you hear? Run fast, and don't you never come back. Thank you, Lord. Thank you. Nabi took a step past the woman. So close, he smelled the mingled odors of their frightened bodies. Eased past her sideways, so he wouldn't turn his naked backside to her. He was about to run when she touched his upper arm. Here. The woman thrust her wadded bonnet into his hand and squinted up. It's a hot sun. He took the bonnet and she said, angry sounding, for your woman. Nabi glanced toward the man, tiny in the far field. And for the first time, the woman smiled, spreading her badly cracked lips to reveal small brown-stained teeth. Her sudden wide smile gave her an addled look. Huh, she rasped, he won't miss no bonnet. He never pays me no mind. If you please, mistress, one thing more. The woman neither shook her head nor nodded. She simply waited, one eyebrow arched. How close to the gulf are we, mistress? The woman gave an involuntary smile, little more than a muscle twitch. This place ain't got no name. You done passed Bayou Cane. It's back a good piece to Thibodeau and a hard way across the marsh to New Iberia. I ain't never been to the Gulf. Nabi had never heard of Thibodeau, and it was not on Joseph's map. After all these miles of walking, Nobby had decided there was precious little on Joseph's map. "How far to Texas, mistress?" "What matters," Portus Gore had said, "is how a man sits a horse." The woman shook her head. "You got to cross the marshland, and some days later the Sabine River. And I wager Sabine ain't near as purty as it sounds. And I wager it's a lifetime of walking from this here place." A heartbeat later, Nobby raced through the woods, flesh stung by limbs and pine cones, the spontaneous duet in the clearing, already a strange dream he could not clearly remember. Thank you.